Captain Jake Morrison stood at the viewing deck of the human diplomatic vessel Meridian, watching the massive space station Xarion Prime grow larger on the horizon. The station was huge, bigger than any human city, with gleaming towers that stretched out like fingers into the darkness of space. Ships from dozens of different worlds moved around it like busy insects. Jake had been to the Galactic Council headquarters many times over the past 10 years, but today felt different. The emergency meeting call had come without warning, and the tone of the message worried him. In his 53 years, 30 of them spent in space, he had learned to trust his gut feelings about danger. Dr. Lisa Carter joined him at the window, her tablet in hand as always. She was the best xenobiologist in human space, someone who could talk to any alien species and make them feel comfortable. Her brown hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her green eyes showed the same concern Jake felt. "The readings are strange today," Lisa said, looking at her tablet. "I'm picking up massive energy signatures from the Xarion ships, much higher than normal diplomatic levels." Jake nodded. The Xarions were beings made of pure energy who lived in crystal containers shaped like tall, thin pyramids. One of the most powerful races in the galaxy, and when they got excited, their energy levels spiked dramatically. "Any word from Ambassador Henderson?" Jake asked. "He's already inside the council chambers with the other human representatives. Commander Brooks is with him, along with the full diplomatic team." The Meridian docked with a soft thud that Jake barely felt. Within minutes, they were walking through the corridors of Xarion Prime, past aliens of every shape and size imaginable. There were the tall, blue-skinned Aquatic Federation members, with their gill slits fluttering. The crystalline beings from the Dominion that looked like walking gemstones. And the small, furry creatures from the hive minds who moved in perfect synchronization. Jake had always loved this diversity. Humans had been part of the Galactic Council for 57 years now. Ever since first contact in 2330 in that time. They had established colonies on 12 different star systems and built peaceful relationships with 43 alien species. It was humanity's greatest achievement. The council chamber was packed when they arrived. Jake and Lisa took seats in the observation area, looking down at the massive circular floor where representatives from every major galactic civilization sat in their specialized environments. Some needed water tanks. Others required specific atmospheric conditions. A few existed as pure energy forms floating in containment fields. Ambassador Paul Henderson sat in the human section. He stood a man in his 60s, with gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. Next to him was Commander Amy Brooks, the head of human military affairs, her uniform crisp and her posture straight. Jake knew both of them well and trusted their judgment completely. The session began when the Xarion representative, being called Xexamor, rose from their crystal container. When Xarion spoke, their voices came through translation devices that made them sound like musical chimes mixed with thunder. Fellow council members, Xexamor began. "We face a crisis that threatens the very foundation of our galactic civilization. The human species has grown beyond all acceptable parameters." Jake felt his stomach drop. He looked at Lisa, who had gone pale. Xexamor continued. "In 57 years, humans have expanded from 1 world to 13. Their population has grown from 7 billion to over 5 billion across their colonies. They develop new technologies at a rate that defies our models of safe advancement. Holographic displays appeared above the chamber floor, showing human colonies, trade routes, and development statistics. To Jake's eyes, they looked like normal growth patterns for a healthy civilization, but several alien representatives were making worried sounds. More concerning, Xexamor said, is their psychological profile. Humans question everything. They challenge established protocols. They refuse to accept, because that's how it's always been done, as a valid reason for anything. This behavior is spreading to other species through contact with human diplomats and traders. Vexasari of the Crystalline Dominion stood next, there. Gem-like body reflecting the chamber lights in rainbow patterns. The Xarions speak truth. My own people have begun questioning our caste system after meeting human philosophers. Our rigid social structure, stable for 10,000 years, shows signs of breakdown. Jake watched as more representatives voiced. Similar concerns. Hive minds complained that humans were teaching individual thinking to their drones. The Aquatic Federation worried about human environmental ideas changing their ocean management policies. Ambassador Henderson finally stood. To respond, his voice carried clearly through the chamber as he activated his translator. Honored council members, I understand your concerns, but what you describe as problems, we see as progress. Yes, humans ask questions. We grow and develop quickly. But look at what we've accomplished together. Henderson gestured and new holograms appeared showing joint projects between humans and other species. Medical research that had eliminated diseases affecting 6 different races. Terraforming technology that had created new homes for displaced populations. Peaceful solutions to border disputes that might have led to wars. In 57 years of membership, humans have never started a war, never broken a treaty, never harmed another species intentionally. We've served as mediators in 18 conflicts, saving millions of lives and preventing 3 major wars. Jake felt pride swell in his chest. Henderson was right. Humanity had been a force for good in the galaxy. But Xexamore wasn't finished. Ambassador Henderson speaks of human achievements, but he ignores the threat they represent. Humans reproduce too quickly, spread too fast, and influence others too easily. Left unchecked, they will dominate the galaxy within 500 years. Not through conquest, but through cultural absorption. The debate continued for hours. Species after species voiced their opinions. The Silicate Collective supported the humans, as did the Gas Giant Consortium and several smaller races. But the major powers seemed split or worried. Finally, the council moved to vote on something called the Silence Protocol. Jake had never heard of it before, and from the confused murmurs in the human section, neither had their diplomats. The council speaker, an ancient being from the first race, explained in a voice like grinding stone. The Silence Protocol calls for complete isolation of human space from the rest of the galaxy. Energy barriers will be placed around all human systems, preventing travel, communication, or trade. Human species will be left to develop in isolation until such time as they prove they can coexist without threatening galactic stability. Jake's heart stopped. Complete isolation. Cut off from everything they had built over nearly 60 years. Ambassador Henderson jumped to his feet. This is insane. You're talking about imprisoning an entire species for the crime of being successful. We've done nothing wrong. Commander Brooks stood as well, her hand instinctively moving toward where her sidearm would normally be, though weapons weren't allowed in the council chamber. How long? She demanded. How long would this isolation last? Till the human species demonstrates they can exist without disrupting galactic harmony, Xexamore replied. Perhaps a few hundred years, perhaps longer. The vote was called. Jake watched in horror as species after species cast their decision. The Xarion Collective voted for isolation. The Crystalline Dominion agreed. The hive mind supported it. The Aquatic Federation abstained, which counted as agreement. When the final tally appeared, Jake's world collapsed. 7 votes for isolation, 4 against. The Silence Protocol was approved, Ambassador. Henderson's voice broke as he spoke his final words to the council. History will judge this decision harshly. You're not protecting the galaxy from humans. You're protecting yourselves from having to change, from having to grow. And you'll realize your mistake when it's too late. Jake's communicator buzzed with an emergency message from the Meridian. The ship's sensors were detecting massive energy buildups around human space. The barriers were already beginning to form. By the time Jake and Lisa reached their ship, the first reports were coming in from human colonies. Communication with non-human worlds was becoming impossible. Trade ships were being turned back by invisible walls of energy. Humanity was being cut off from the galaxy they had called home for over half a century. Jake stood on the bridge of the Meridian, watching the energy barriers grow stronger around them like prison walls made of light. 57 years of friendship, cooperation, shared dreams were ending because the galaxy was afraid of human potential. He didn't know it yet. But the Galactic Council had just made the biggest mistake in their 10,000-year history. They were about to learn what happened when you left humans alone with their ingenuity, determination, and wounded pride. The age of isolation was beginning, and it would change everything. 15 years had passed since the energy barriers went up around human space. Admiral Jake Morrison stood in the command center of the newly built space station Unity 1. Watching construction crews work on another massive defensive platform, the view from his office showed a sight that would have amazed anyone from the old Galactic Council, where once there had been empty space between human colonies. Now a network of stations, shipyards, and communication relays connected every human world. The barriers that were meant to weaken humanity had instead forced them to become stronger than ever before. Jake was older now, his hair completely gray and lines around his eyes showing the weight of command. But his mind was sharper than ever, focused on the survival and growth of his species. The scared ship captain from 15 years ago had become the leader of the largest military force in human history. Dr. Kevin Walsh entered the office carrying a tablet and wearing the excited expression he always had when he discovered something new. Kevin was younger than Jake, maybe 40 years old, with messy brown hair and thick glasses that made his eyes look bigger than they were. He had spent the last 15 years studying the energy barriers, trying to understand how they worked. "Admiral, you need to see this," Kevin said, practically bouncing with excitement. "We've had another breakthrough with the barrier technology." Jake turned from the window to face the scientist. "Show me." Kevin activated his tablet, and a holographic display appeared showing the energy patterns of the barriers surrounding human space. The display looked like a complex web of light, with different colors representing different energy frequencies. "Barriers aren't actually solid," Kevin explained. "They're made up of layered energy fields that operate on multiple frequencies. The Council assumed humans couldn't detect or manipulate these frequencies, but they were wrong." Jake studied the display. Over the years, he had learned to understand Kevin's technical explanations, though he still preferred simple language. "What does this mean for us? We can create windows in the barriers, small ones, just big enough for a probe or a small ship to pass through. We can't bring them down completely, but we can peek outside." This was the news Jake had been waiting. For 15 years of isolation had left humanity wondering what was happening in the rest of the galaxy. Were the other species thriving without them? Had the Council forgotten about the imprisoned humans entirely? "How soon can we test this?" Jake asked. "The equipment is ready now. We just need permission to try." Jake nodded. "Do it, but carefully. We don't want to alert anyone that we're breaking through." As Kevin left to prepare his experiment, Jake thought about how much had changed since the barriers went up. The first few years had been the hardest. Many humans had fallen into depression, feeling abandoned by the galactic community they had worked so hard to join. Some had even talked about giving up, accepting that humanity was meant to be alone. But humans were stubborn. Instead of giving up, they had worked together like never before. The old national boundaries on Earth had dissolved completely. The colonial governments had merged into a single organization called the United Human Republic. Every human world was now connected by quantum communication. Networks that made talking to someone on the other side of human space as easy as talking to someone next door. Engineer Samantha Torres walked into Jake's office, interrupting his thoughts. Samantha was in her early 30s, with short black hair and strong hands that were always stained with grease from her work. She was the best ship designer in human space, maybe the best who had ever lived. "Admiral, the new prototype is ready for testing," she said, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who knew her work was excellent. Jake followed her to the docking bay, where a sleek ship waited. It was unlike anything humans had built. Before the barriers went up, the hull was made of materials that seemed to shift and change color depending on the angle of the light. The engines were completely silent, and the whole ship seemed to hum with barely contained energy. "This is the Phantom-class Stealth Scout," Samantha explained, running her hand along the hull with obvious pride. "It incorporates everything we've learned about the barrier technology. The hull can phase partially out of normal space, making it almost invisible to sensors. The engines produce no heat signature, and the quantum drives can reach speeds that would have been impossible with old technology." Roy was a tall, serious man in his 50s, with gray haircut military. Short, he had been planning for every possible scenario since the barriers went up, including the possibility that humanity might have to fight their way out of isolation. The defensive networks are ready too, Roy said. Every human world now has orbital weapons platforms, shield generators, and automated defense systems. We have more than 3,000 ships of various classes, from fighters to dreadnoughts. If someone tries to attack us when the barriers come down, they'll get a surprise. Jake nodded, but privately he hoped it wouldn't come to war. Despite what the Council had done to them, he still believed in the possibility of peace. Humans had always been better at making friends than enemies. The test of Kevin's barrier penetration technology took place the next day. Jake watched from the command center as a small probe was launched toward the edge of human space. The probe was no bigger than a basketball, packed with sensors and a quantum communicator that would let it send information back even through the barriers. Approaching the barrier now, Kevin reported, his voice tense with excitement and worry. Energy fields are fluctuating as expected. Beginning phase alignment. On the main screen, Jake could see the probe's camera feed. The barrier looked like a wall of shifting light, beautiful and terrifying at the same time. For 15 years, this had been the edge of human experience, the limit of their world. Phase alignment complete, Kevin announced. The probe is partially out of normal space, beginning barrier penetration. Jake held his breath as the probe moved forward. For a moment, nothing happened. Then suddenly, the wall of light seemed to part like water, creating a small opening just big enough for the probe to pass through. "We're through," Kevin shouted, unable to contain his excitement. The probe is outside the barrier. The probe sensors immediately began collecting data about the space beyond human territory. What they found was shocking. The probe detected debris fields where there should have been busy trade routes. Several space stations that had been major commercial centers were now dark and lifeless. Most surprising of all, there were no signs of the massive military fleets that had once patrolled this region of space. "Something's wrong out there," Jake said quietly. "This area should be full of activity." Over the next few hours, the probe sent back more disturbing information. Communication signals were chaotic and often encrypted, suggesting emergency military channels rather than normal civilian traffic. The probe detected radiation signatures consistent with recent weapons fire. Most concerning of all, it found evidence of refugee ships, small vessels packed with civilians fleeing from something. Admiral Kevin said, his excitement replaced by worry, "I think we need to send a manned mission out there. We need to know what's happening." Jake agreed, but he knew it would be dangerous. If the probe could get through the barrier, so could a small ship with a crew. But once they were outside, they would be on their own, cut off from the rest of humanity. "Who would volunteer for a mission like that?" Jake asked. "I would," said a voice from behind them. Jake turned to see Captain Helen Davis, one of the best pilots in the human fleet. Helen was a woman in her late 30s with red hair and fierce blue eyes. She had been pushing for permission to scout beyond the barriers for years. "It's too dangerous," Jake said. "We don't know what's out there." "That's exactly why we need to go," Helen replied. "We've been isolated for 15 years. We need to know if the galaxy is at peace or at war. We need to know if our friends are safe or if our enemies are gathering strength." Jake looked around the command center at the faces of his people. They had spent 15 years building a new civilization, becoming stronger and more united than ever before. But they were still human, and humans were curious. They needed to know what lay beyond their prison walls. "Prepare a stealth ship," Jake ordered. "We're going to take a look at what the galaxy has become without us." We didn't know it yet, but what they would find would change everything. The Galactic Council had made a terrible mistake when they isolated humanity. They had removed the one species that held their fragile civilization together, and now everything was falling apart. Humanity was about to discover that sometimes the greatest punishment is getting exactly what you ask for. Captain Helen Davis gripped the controls of the stealth ship Pathfinder as it slipped through the opening in the energy barrier. Behind her, the familiar glow of human space grew smaller until it disappeared completely. Ahead lay the unknown galaxy, dark and silent after 15 years of separation. Helen was not alone on this dangerous mission. With her were 3 other volunteers who had insisted on coming despite the risks. Dr. Richard Stone sat at the science station, beard making him look older than his 50 years. Richard was a xenarchaeologist who had spent his career studying alien civilizations. Next to him was Lieutenant Carl Jackson, a young pilot barely 25 years old with brown hair and eager eyes. At the communications station sat Specialist Nina Foster, a woman in her 30s with black hair and the sharp mind of a trained intelligence analyst. "Barrier cleared," Helen announced, her voice steady despite the excitement she felt. "We're officially outside human space for the first time in 15 years. The first thing they noticed was the silence. Space had never been truly quiet, not since humans had joined the galactic community. There had always been communication. Signals, navigation beacons, and the background chatter of thousands of ships moving along trade routes. Now there was almost nothing. "I'm picking up some signals," Nina reported, her fingers dancing across her control panel. "But they're scattered and weak. Most of them appear to be distress calls." Dr. Stone was already scanning the nearby star systems with his instruments. What he found made his face go pale. "Helen, you need to see this. The Kepler station should be right here." He pointed to a spot on the star chart where a major trading post had operated for over a century. Helen turned the ship toward the coordinates and activated the long-range sensors. Where Kepler station should have been, they found only debris. Twisted metal and broken hull plates drifted in space like the bones of some giant creature. "My God," Helen whispered. "What happened here?" They moved closer, and Dr. Stone began scanning the wreckage. The damage patterns suggest weapons fire. Heavy energy weapons, the kind used by military vessels, but also some kind of explosive charges placed from the inside. "Sabotage?" Carl asked. "Or civil war," Nina said grimly. She had been monitoring communication frequencies and was hearing things that chilled her blood. "I'm picking up military. Emergency channels. Something about refugee camps and territorial disputes." Helen made a decision. "We're going to investigate the Xarion home system. If anyone could tell us what happened, it would be them." The journey to Xarion space took 2 days at maximum stealth speed. During that time, they passed through what had once been some of the busiest regions of the galaxy. Trade routes that had carried goods between hundreds of worlds were now empty. Space stations that had housed millions of beings were darkened, abandoned. But the worst discovery came when they reached the outer edge of Xarion territory. The energy beings who had been so worried about human expansion were now fighting a brutal civil war among themselves. The space around their crystal worlds was filled with the wreckage of their pyramid-shaped ships. "I'm detecting 2 distinct factions," Dr. Stone reported. "Energy signatures are different. Looks like the Xarions split into conservative and progressive groups." Nina was listening to their communications, her face growing more troubled by the minute. "They're calling each other traitors and destroyers of tradition. The conservatives say the progressives have been corrupted by foreign ideas. The progressives say the conservatives are holding back their evolution." Helen realized with growing horror what had happened. "Foreign ideas, they mean human ideas, don't they?" "It looks that way," Nina confirmed. "From what I can understand, some Xarions wanted to adopt human-style democratic reforms after we were isolated. Others wanted to maintain their old hierarchical system. The argument tore their civilization apart. They stayed long enough to confirm that the Xarion collective no longer existed as a unified power. Half their worlds were controlled by each faction, and they were fighting a war that had been going on for over a decade. The next stop was crystalline Dominion space, hoping to find more stability there. Instead, they found something even worse. The single, unified crystal civilization had shattered into dozens of smaller nations, each claiming to be the true inheritor of their people's legacy. "The fragmentation is complete," Dr. Stone observed, as they watched crystal beings fighting each other with weapons that turned their enemies into sand. What was once a stable empire spanning 40 star systems is now at least 30 separate kingdoms, all at war with each other. Carl was studying the tactical displays. Their military technology has actually gotten worse. They're using older weapons, less sophisticated ships. It's like they forgot how to work together. Helen was beginning to understand the scope of the disaster. "Nina, see if you can find any records of what caused this." Nina worked for hours, breaking into abandoned databases and intercepting communications. What she found painted a clear picture of civilizational collapse. It started about 5 years after we were isolated, she reported. The Crystalline Dominion had a succession crisis when their old emperor died. Normally, such disputes were resolved through the council mediation process. But without human mediators available, they couldn't reach an agreement. Human mediators? Helen asked. Apparently humans had been serving as neutral arbitrators in succession disputes for decades. We were the only species all the other races trusted to be fair. Without us, the crystal beings couldn't agree on a new leader, so they split apart. The pattern was becoming clear, but Helen needed to see more. They traveled to Aquatic Federation space, hoping to find at least one civilization that had remained stable. What they found was perhaps the most heartbreaking sight of all. The water worlds of the Aquatic Federation were under strict quarantine. Automated defense systems fired on any ship that tried to approach, and the few communication signals they could intercept spoke of a plague that had killed billions. The plague started 8 years ago. Nina translated from the garbled transmissions, something that affected their water-breathing biology. 60% of their population died before they could develop a treatment. Dr. Stone was reviewing his historical records. Helen, I think I know what happened. The Aquatic Federation used to rely on human medical researchers for their healthcare advances. Human doctors were the only ones who could work effectively with water-based biologies because of our adaptability. So when we were cut off, they lost access to the medical expertise they needed to fight the plague, Dr. Stone finished. Been in isolation ever since, afraid that contact with other species might bring new diseases they can't treat. The final stop on their reconnaissance mission was the territory of the hive minds. Here they found something that filled them with dread. The collective consciousness species had abandoned their carefully maintained borders and were expanding aggressively into abandoned space. They're consuming everything, Carl reported, his voice tight with fear. Empty worlds, abandoned stations, even debris fields. They're breaking down all the material and using it to build new hive structures. Without the council regulations to limit their expansion, they've reverted to their original nature, Dr. Stone explained. Before joining galactic civilization, the hive minds were a consuming species. The council treaties kept them in check. But those treaties required human enforcement. Nina was monitoring their communications, trying to understand their intentions. They're not hostile exactly, but they don't recognize any authority except their own collective will, they consider. All abandoned territory to be free for consumption. As they prepared to return to human space, Helen's communication system picked up a signal that made everyone on the ship freeze. It was a transmission from the remnants of the Galactic Council, broadcast on emergency frequencies to anyone who might be listening. "This is Council Speaker Mordith, of the First Race," the ancient voice said, filled with exhaustion and desperation. "To any human vessels that might receive this message, we formally request immediate assistance. The galaxy is dying without you. The silence protocol was a mistake. Please, if you can hear this, help us." Helen looked at her crew, seeing her own shock reflected in their faces. The mighty Galactic Council, which had voted to imprison humanity 15 years ago, was now begging for their help. "We need to get back," Helen said quietly. "Admiral Morrison needs to see this." As the Pathfinder slipped back through the barrier into human space, Helen realized that everything had changed. Humanity was no longer the isolated, punished species they had been when she left. They were now the only stable civilization left. In the galaxy, the species that had feared human expansion and influence had learned what happened when that influence was removed. Without human mediators, their disputes had become wars. Without human medical knowledge, plagues had become extinctions. Without human economic systems, their trade had collapsed. The galaxy had gotten exactly what it asked for when it voted to silence humanity. The problem was, they had forgotten that silence was not the same as peace, and now they were discovering that some voices, once silenced, might never speak again. Admiral Morrison was going to have some very difficult decisions to make. President Alex Turner stood at the podium in the Great Assembly Hall on Earth, looking out at the faces of 500 representatives from every human world. The emergency session of the human parliament had been called within hours of Captain Davis returning with her shocking report about the galaxy's collapse. Alex was a woman in her 50s with silver hair and intelligent brown eyes that had seen both triumph and tragedy. She had been elected president of the United Human Republic just 3 years ago. But the decision she faced today would define not just her presidency, but the future of humanity itself. The hall was completely silent as she began to speak. Fellow humans, we stand at a crossroads that will determine who we are as a species. The galaxy that cast us out 15 years ago now comes to us in desperation, begging for the help they once rejected. Behind her, massive screens showed the images Captain Davis had brought back: burning Xarion worlds, shattered crystal kingdoms, empty space where thriving stations once stood. The visual evidence of galactic collapse was overwhelming. In the front row sat Admiral Susan Kelly, the commander of the Human Relief Fleet. Susan was a tall woman with short black hair and calm blue eyes that never showed fear. Even in the worst situations, she had spent the last week preparing plans for humanitarian missions, though she didn't know if they would ever be approved. The question before us is simple, President Turner continued. We help those who abandon us, or do we let them face the consequences of their choices? Representative John Walsh from the Colony World New Boston stood up. John was a man in his 40s who had lost his brother in a mining accident during the early years of isolation. When they couldn't get replacement parts for safety equipment from alien manufacturers. With respect, Madam President, the question isn't simple at all, John said, his voice carrying the anger that many humans still felt. They didn't just reject us, they imprisoned us. They treated us like criminals for the crime of being successful. Why should we risk human lives to save people who threw us away? Murmurs of agreement rippled through the assembly. The pain of isolation was still fresh for many people. Families had been separated when the barriers went up. Trade relationships built over decades had been destroyed overnight. Many humans had died during the difficult early years when they had to completely rebuild their supply chains and support systems. But Representative Maria Santos from the Mars colonies stood to offer a different perspective. Maria was younger, in her 30s, with long brown hair and the passionate voice of someone who truly believed in human values. Representative Walsh speaks of the pain we've endured. And he's right, Maria said. But if we let that pain turn us into the kind of people who ignore suffering when we have the power to help, then we've lost something more important than trade agreements or diplomatic status. We've lost our humanity. Admiral Kelly stood and was recognized by the president. I've been studying the reconnaissance reports, and I believe we face a strategic imperative beyond moral considerations. The galaxy is collapsing into chaos. If we do nothing, that chaos will eventually reach our borders. Refugee fleets are already massing near our territory. The hive minds are expanding without restraint. We can help stabilize the situation now. Or we can wait and face much bigger problems later. Dr. Martin Garcia, the chief medical researcher for the Republic, rose from his seat. Martin was a quiet man in his 50s, with gray hair and hands that shook slightly from years of working with dangerous research materials. But his voice was steady as he spoke. I've been analyzing the plague that hit the Aquatic Federation. He said, it's a variant of a disease we studied 20 years ago. I know how to treat it. I know how to stop it from spreading to other species. While we've been debating politics, billions of intelligent beings are dying from something I could cure in a matter of months. The hall erupted in discussion as representatives turned to argue with each other. Some demanded that humanity focus on its own needs after years of forced isolation. Others insisted that helping the galaxy was both a moral duty and a strategic necessity. President Turner called for order, and the hall slowly quieted. We will hear from one more speaker before we move to preliminary votes. Diplomat Claire Thompson walked to the speaker's platform. Claire was a young woman, only 28 years old, with red hair and green eyes that burned with conviction. She was the daughter of Ambassador Paul Henderson, the man who had spoken humanity's final words to the Galactic Council 15 years ago. My father was there when they voted to silence us, Claire began, her voice carrying clearly through the hall. I was 13 years old when the barriers went up. I've spent half my life in isolation, cut off from the galaxy my father helped build relationships with. She paused, looking around the hall at the faces of people who had lived through the same experience. I have every reason to hate them. Every reason to want revenge. But my father taught me something before he died 5 years ago. He said that the measure of a civilization isn't how it treats its friends, but how it responds to those who have wronged it when they need help. Claire activated a holographic display showing refugee ships detected near human space. Thousands of small vessels packed with families fleeing the chaos, afraid to approach the barriers, but with nowhere else to go. These aren't the council members who voted against us. These are ordinary people whose only crime was trusting their leaders to make the right decisions. Children who don't understand why their worlds are burning. Families who just want to live in peace. She gestured to another image showing a Xarion medical ship broadcasting distress signals. This ship has been sending emergency medical requests for 3 days. They have wounded from both sides of their civil war aboard. They're asking anyone who can hear them for help, not knowing that the only people close enough to respond are the humans they helped imprison. Claire's voice grew stronger as she reached her conclusion. We have a choice. It can be the species that turns its back on suffering because we were wronged, or we can be the species that rises above our pain to help others, even when they don't deserve it. We can show the galaxy what humanity really means. The applause started slowly, then built until the entire hall was on its feet. President Turner let it continue for a full minute before calling for order. The proposal before us, she announced, is to begin limited humanitarian operations outside our territory. Admiral Kelly has prepared a plan for medical relief missions to refugee areas and plague-affected worlds. We will not rejoin the Galactic Council. Yes. And we will not restore full diplomatic relations until significant reforms are implemented. But we will provide aid where it is desperately needed. The vote was closer than Claire's speech might have suggested. 267 representatives voted in favor of humanitarian aid, while 233 voted against. The margin was narrow, but it was enough. Admiral Kelly was authorized to begin planning relief missions immediately. Dr. Garcia was given unlimited resources to develop treatments for the aquatic plague. The barriers around human space would be modified to allow carefully screened humanitarian vessels to pass through. As the session ended, President Turner remained at the podium, watching the representatives file out. Some looked satisfied with the decision, others clearly unhappy. The unity that had sustained humanity through 15 years of isolation was showing cracks under the pressure of this new challenge. Admiral Kelly approached the podium as the hall emptied. Madam President, I can have the first medical ships ready to launch within 72 hours. But I need to know, what are our rules of engagement if we encounter hostile forces? President Turner considered the question carefully. Our mission is humanitarian relief, Admiral. We defend ourselves if attacked, but we don't take sides in their wars. We help anyone who needs help, regardless of which faction they belong to. And if the Council formally requests our return to galactic politics, then we tell them the same thing Ambassador Henderson told them 15 years ago. Actions have consequences. They wanted us gone, so we left. If they want us back, they need to prove they've learned from their mistakes. 3 days later, the first human relief ships in 15 years crossed the energy barriers and headed into the chaos of the wider galaxy. They carried medical supplies, food, and water purification systems. More importantly, they carried a message. Humanity had not been broken by isolation. If anything, it had grown stronger. The galaxy was about to learn that sometimes the people you push away are the ones you need the most. 2 years had passed since the first human relief ships crossed the barriers. Fleet Admiral Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the massive starship Guardian, watching a sight that would have been impossible just a few years ago around his ship. Vessels from a dozen different species flew in perfect formation, their crews working together to protect a convoy of refugee ships heading to new homes. Jake was 73 years old now, his hair completely white and his face lined with decades of command decisions, but his eyes were bright with satisfaction as he watched former enemies working side by side with human crews. Admiral, we're receiving a transmission from the Xarion vessel Crystal Light, reported Lieutenant Commander Beth Adams, the ship's communications officer. Beth was a young woman with blonde hair who had joined the fleet after the barriers came down. part of a new generation that saw cooperation with aliens as normal. "Put them through," Jake ordered. The holographic display showed Zarthel, a Xarion, who had been part of the progressive faction during their civil war. His crystal container glowed with warm golden light, a sign of contentment among his people. "Admiral Morrison, our sensors show the convoy is approaching the safe zone. The refugee families are very grateful for the protection your fleet has provided." Jake smiled. "We're all in this together now, Zarthel. These families have been through enough." The convoy was carrying survivors from 3 different wars that had finally ended with human mediation. Crystal beings who had lost their worlds in the fragmentation conflicts, Aquatic Federation members whose planets were still recovering from the plague, even some hive mind drones who had broken away from the collective and wanted to try individual. Life Captain Tony Mitchell appeared on Jake's other communication screen. Tony was commanding the Starship Harmony, the first vessel in the galaxy to have an integrated crew from 12 different species. He was a man in his 40s with brown hair and the kind of easy smile that made everyone feel comfortable. "Admiral, we're ready to begin the final approach to New Haven Colony," Tony reported. "Our passengers are excited to see their new homes." New Haven was one of 50 colonies established in the past 2 years specifically for refugees from the galactic conflicts. These worlds were administered jointly by humans and the species who live there. Using the new democratic principles that were slowly spreading across the galaxy, Jake watched the convoy disappear toward the colony world and turned his attention to other matters. Today was an important day for more than just refugee resettlement. Today was the formal signing of the new Galactic Compact on Earth. The journey to Earth took 3 days, during which Jake's fleet was joined by ships from every major surviving civilization in the galaxy. The sight of this peaceful armada approaching humanity's homeworld would have been unimaginable during the years of isolation. Earth itself had changed dramatically. The orbital space around the planet was now filled with massive stations designed to accommodate visitors from different worlds. Some stations had water-filled sections for aquatic species. Others had specialized atmospheric controls for methane breathing beings, and several were designed as pure energy environments for the Xarion's ambassador. Emma Rodriguez met Jake at the primary diplomatic station. Emma was a woman in her 40s, with dark hair and the kind of diplomatic skills that had made her invaluable in rebuilding galactic relationships. She had spent the last year traveling between different worlds, negotiating the terms of the new compact. "Admiral, the representatives are all here," Emma reported. 49 species have sent delegations to sign the compact. It's the largest gathering of alien species in human space since before the barriers went up. Dr. Peter Kim joined them as they traveled down to Earth's surface. Peter was the architect of the new governmental framework that would replace the old Galactic Council. He was a thin man in his 50s with black hair and the intense focus of someone who had spent years studying how to prevent the mistakes of the past. "The structure is solid," Peter said, reviewing his tablet one final time. "No single species can dominate the others. Humans will serve as permanent mediators, but major decisions require consensus among regional representatives. Cultural exchange. Programs are mandatory, and there are built-in protections for minority species." The signing ceremony took place in Geneva, in the same building where humans had signed their first major treaties centuries ago. The Great Hall had been modified to accommodate delegates from dozens of different species, with environmental controls that could support everything from crystalline beings to gas giant dwellers. Jake took his place among the human delegation, watching as representatives filed in. Many faces were familiar from the years of humanitarian work. Others belonged to species that had only recently emerged from isolation or civil war. The Xarion delegation was led by Zarthal, representing the reunified energy beings who had ended their civil war with human help. The Crystal Peoples sent delegates from 15 different kingdoms that were slowly learning to work together again. Even the Aquatic Federation had emerged from quarantine, their plague finally cured by Dr. Garcia's medical team. Most surprisingly, there were representatives from the hive minds. These were not the collective consciousness they had been before, but individual drones who had chosen to break away and form their own democratic society. They called themselves the Free Minds, and they spoke for thousands of former Hive members who wanted to try a different way of life. President Turner, now in her second term, opened the ceremony with words that Jake thought captured the moment perfectly. "We gather here not to restore what was, but to build something better." The old Galactic Council was built on fear and the desire to maintain the status quo. The new Galactic Compact is built on hope and the understanding that diversity makes us stronger. One by one, the representatives came forward to sign the compact. As each species added their mark to the document, they spoke about what the new alliance meant to them. Zarthal spoke for the Zephyrians. "We learned that trying to stop change only destroys us from within. Humans taught us that growth and stability can exist together." Vexmari, representing the reformed Crystal Kingdoms, said, "Our people shattered because we forgot how to listen to each other. This compact ensures that every voice is heard." Deep Current of the Aquatic Federation was brief but moving. "You saved us when we thought we were beyond saving. We'll not forget that kindness." Perhaps most touching was the statement from Drone, who chose freedom. Speaking for the Free Minds, "We were told that individual thought was chaos. Humans showed us that individual thought working together creates something greater than any collective." When all 49 species had signed, President Turner added humanity's signature to the document. As she set down the pen, the hall erupted in sounds of celebration from dozens of different species. Crystalline beings chimed like bells, Zephyrians hummed with harmonic frequencies, and aquatic delegates splashed in their tanks. But the most meaningful moment came after the ceremony, when Jake found himself standing outside the building with Captain Mitchell and several crew members from the Harmony. "Admiral," said Ensign Kreddle, a young Zephyrian who served as the ship's navigation officer, "I wanted to thank you for everything humans have done. My parents were killed in the Civil War. Without human refugee programs, I would have died." 2. Standing next to her was Chief Engineer Blix, a crystal being whose family had lost their home in the fragmentation. "My people thought humans were dangerous because you asked too many questions. Now, I understand that questions are how we grow." Jake looked around at the mixed group of beings who had become not just allies, but friends. "You don't need to thank us. We're all part of the same galaxy. When one of us suffers, we all suffer. When one of us succeeds, we all succeed." As the celebration continued into the night, Jake found a quiet moment to reflect on the journey that had brought them all here. 15 years ago, the galaxy had tried to silence humanity out of fear. That silence had nearly destroyed everything they had built together. But humans had not stayed silent. They had emerged from isolation stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever to build a better future. The galaxy had learned that diversity was not something to be feared and controlled, but something to be celebrated and protected. The stars above Earth now shone on a galaxy at peace, where different species worked together as equals. Children from dozens of worlds attended integrated schools, learning that their differences made them stronger. Trade flowed freely again. But now it was based on mutual respect rather than exploitation. Jake knew there would be challenges ahead. Peace was harder to maintain than war was to start. But as he watched young beings from different species laughing together in the celebration, he felt confident about the future. Humanity had been left in silence, and the galaxy had faced the consequences. Now, with voices raised together in harmony, they were building something that would last for generations to come.